Hello, everyone. This is Konrad Carding, your host for today. I'm a professor at University of Pennsylvania. I like hats, as you can see. This is not the hat that you guys like. But as you know, I'm into Bayesian statistics and machine learning, so I often have to wear this hat. But after seeing the results from the poll, I have to apologize. I really need to fix something because this hat won with a huge margin. So welcome everyone who voted for pink hats. So today I'll be joined on stage by Kate Bonin, who is currently at NYU and is about to move on to be professor at Indiana University at Bloomington. Kate, thanks for joining us. Why don't you briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Q&A. Like Conrad said, my name is Kate Bonin. I study visual processing and sensory motor problems. And basically, I'm interested in how we see when we're walking and normative models of visual perception during natural behavior. You have to walk around in the world, you're looking around, you're moving, you move your head. How do we process that information? And I'm wearing a bicycle hat, which no one likes, and that makes me sad, but I'll live with it. It was the only hat in my apartment, and I was told that today is a hat day, so I'm wearing a hat. It was required.
But you can still fix it on the poll. As far as I know, you can go into a poll and remove your I think this yellow bicycle helmet is really awesome. So the next person to join us is our CEO, Megan. Megan, why don't you quickly introduce yourself?
Hey guys, so you all have seen me lots today, both in the welcome video yesterday and then in the outro today. So hopefully you guys know who I am, but my name is Megan Peters. I'm an assistant professor at UC Irvine in cognitive sciences. And I study visual perception and metacognition and consciousness using cognitive and computational neuroscience techniques in humans. So I use computational modeling and fMRI and a little bit of EEG, and also do some zapping, as you guys heard today, using TMS and other electrical stimulation of the brain, trying to figure out how our brains create our subjective experiences of the world. And so I'm happy to be here and talk about models with you guys. And I'm also really sad, by the way, that the big hat and the black and white striped hat are not winning at all. So I'm kind of upset, and I'm wondering whether maybe I should switch to the hat.
No, I think we should ignore public opinion.
Fair enough.
Take it or leave it. I'll be wearing my big hat. That's how we roll here. Now it's now after the introductions, let's jump right back in. And maybe let me briefly say why I think this is so important. So we do neuroscience. When we do neuroscience, we cannot avoid but make philosophical statements, because in a way we decide which models we like and which models we don't like. And that difference ultimately is about what we think is important. And what we think is important is not something that we can read up on something. That's something that we need to make our own decisions. And that's why I think it's so important that we think about the philosophical and the value. So let's briefly review the 12 points that we've been talking about here. So there's useful, and there will be a poll. And I will not open the poll until we went through all of them, because otherwise the first one will just totally win. So let's go through those 12 points. The first one is, some people like useful models. What that means is models that if we implement them can actually solve real world problems. And you can say, that's awesome, because if they can implement real world problems, then we can use them for something. And that's why it's nice to have models that are useful. The second one is normative models, where we can say, does the solution that we find in the brain or in behavior, is this the optimal solution to a problem that really exists in the outside world? So that's different from useful. In the second case, we want to ask, to which level is the brain the optimal solution to a generic problem in the outside world? There's some of us that really care about clinically relevant models. Can a model help us produce the insights to develop or maybe evaluate clinical interventions? There's people who like models to inspire experiments. Like, we go through the model, we build it, it has various components, we can see what happens if we mess with stuff, and then we can see if that inspires us to do experiments that mess with stuff and see and have things that we can compare. There are people that are really interested in microscopic realism. What does that mean? You can say, I measure tuning curves. I want to ask, are the tuning curves actually similar between my model and reality? Maybe are the synaptic learning rules the same as them? There's people that are interested in macroscopic realism. Maybe is the average activity in some brain area the same as the average activity somewhere in my model? There are people who are interested in behavioral realism. Does the model faithfully describe the behavioral data that we obtain? There are people who are into representational ideas. Is it that the representation, is it that what the neurons jointly encode, is that the same between the two, between the model and reality? There are people who like compact models, where you could say, if a model is short, then I can write it and I can understand it because it's so small. And that's why it's good to have models that are compact. Maybe if I like that, I would be willing to trade that off against something else. But if I have a very small equation that describes most of the behavior, and I could have a much longer equation that describes a little more of behavior, but I want compact equations. There's people that like analytically tractable models. There's a lot of people who gain a lot of insights by trying to understand, basically have equations that they can solve with pencil and paper, and that like provides an insight to them that they can't have otherwise. There are people who want interpretable models, models that they can kind of like put into context of biology. And then there's people who just really like beautiful models. Now, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, of course, but there are a lot of models that a lot of people in our community agree that these are just incredibly beautiful models. And there is something that makes them resonate with the way we are. So these are the 12 types. And let's like immediately put that poll on. And here's the poll for all of you. Now I want all of you, every single person who's in the audience, to go to the polls and vote for the one of the 12 criteria that is most important for you. And to already preempt a question that you will undoubtedly ask. Is it that every person or every paper can have only one of them? No. Of course, a lot of papers combine multiple such criteria. But it's important for us to be aware of what they are. And in reality, if you concentrate on all of them, you will probably produce models that are very hard to make sense of because they kind of appeal to everything. Now, these criteria lead to a lot of problems in the neuroscience community because people dislike one another's models. And in possibly the majority of cases, it's not about, say, the mathematics being wrong or like it not describing a lot of data. It's really just about that maybe I like models that are representational and maybe Kate likes models that are normative. And I'll be like, but Kate, your model is useless. It doesn't describe representations. And Kate will be like, but Conrad, I will have to reject your paper because it doesn't lead to any insights about why the brain is the way it is. And to avoid this kind of like useless disagreement, we need to be aware of what the claims are that we make in a paper. So why don't we see how things are? Wow, this is beautiful. Like it's very distributed here. There's a lot of people in this session that are into behavioral realism. This is interesting. The Europeans were considerably more into usefulness. I wonder where that difference is coming from. Megan, what was it in Asia? Was there anything that clearly differed?
I think it was last night, so I don't remember exactly. It was late last night. But
what you guys don't know is that that all of us have been sleeping a very limited amount recently.
Yeah, so last night was a little bit of a late night, so I don't really remember, but I do remember this. So clinically relevant was like microscopic before, and now it's actually a pretty hefty amount. So I think that that's kind of interesting too. And so that we can talk about, why clinically relevant might be like more or less useful. And I think people might have changed their mind by the time we got to the end of the talk there, but I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. I think useful also was kind of winning. Maybe we can go back and look. I should have taken a picture. It just wasn't going to happen last night.
But Megan, the data is there, and in fact, for everyone, we will have at least on our side, we get the logs of what everyone plays, and maybe we can even do something useful with it. Okay,
yeah, we should go look.
We have a lot of slides to get through, and then we have a lot of questions to get through. So let's jump right in. Let's look at the next page, Megan.
Well, so first there's this, which is the happened in the poll that you guys actually ran. And so useful is kind of winning here. Clinical is like not winning really at all. Interpretation, look at the difference between interpretation for our group. Interpretation was like barely in there, and interpretation here is like really very big. It's like the biggest one actually. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah. Huh. All right. Well, but this just shows you, right, that everybody's ideas are different about what they think is the right goal, and that's okay. So this is the next thing that we need to do, though, right?
Great. Exactly. So, Megan, do you want to introduce the reflection slide, or should I?
Whichever. You can do it if you want.
Okay, cool. As I'm the host, I guess I should be doing it. So, Neomatch Academy is in a unique situation. There is no other summer school like Neomatch Academy. Like if you run like a small course in an area where others run courses already, you can just focus on implementing or copying the courses that work well. Neomatch Academy doesn't really have courses that we can meaningfully copy. So that is why this is so important. And this is why we will ask you to do this right now. So please go to these web pages. If someone could like copy and paste those links into it, that would be fantastic. But basically, let's see. I'm sure someone will find them. These are questionnaires, and they basically give us the feedback that we need to make this be maximally useful. And in fact, we will try to be reactive even during Neomatch Academy to keep making it better as we keep going. And so you saw here we have like exactly, yeah, there we have the two of them. So if you're interactive, go to the interactive one. If you're observer, go to the observer one that we have there. And I will be quiet here for 3 minutes, or I'll just be chit-chatting to give you the chance to do this right now. And so please do us the favor and go there right now.
Can I add one thing too? That like this reflection process isn't just for us, it's also for you guys. It's like to think about what's working, what's not working for you, and like where you came into today, which is just day one, and where you left today, just day one. But we're going to try to do this every day. And so this will kind of help you think about where you're coming from and what the stuff that you learned today and the stuff that you went over, like how that's actually applicable to the work that you want to be doing in the future. So it's not just for us, it is for you guys too. So please do this. Take it seriously. Thanks.
Right. And I want to, yeah.
Oh, good question. Who is a mentor for the questionnaire? So you guys haven't been assigned mentors yet, to my knowledge, right? So you can probably just put, not applicable.
Not applicable, yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
And same thing. I think there's a project question, and that also should not be applicable so far.
Yeah, but you'll get there.
Let me say one more thing about the question. So what's going on here is already perfect. So I see a lot of you are asking questions, and a lot of you are answering questions already. It really helps to understand things, to answer other people's questions. The thing is also, we would love to answer everyone's questions. But for a lot of the Q&A sessions, we will just not get through them because like as we discuss questions, you will have new questions. And there's a lot of people in the audience, which means we will not be getting to all questions in most cases. So in that sense, it's great that you already try and like answer one another's questions. And we're super thankful for people who make sure that like all questions get answered. And I'm sorry about that, but like, what can I say? We can't get through all of them. At least in the Europe one, there was no way of getting through it. Okay, so let's give them another minute. Oh yeah, and talking about chit-chat, like those mascots, like I can see them on Neurostars, and oh my god, this is just so cool. It's like we're a community, and it's important to have like a culture in a community. And here come the koalas. Great. So, and I should say one thing. It sometimes happens that people lose sound on Crowdcast. Reboot your browser. It happens that you have a low-speed internet, in which case, see our YouTube stream, which requires less bandwidth. And if for some reason sound stops, reboot your browser. If you have horrible sound quality, make sure you don't have 2 tabs in which Neomatch Academy is running. It has happened to me multiple times, and it's always a little embarrassing. Great. Okay, I think we gave everyone time to answer it. Megan, is there another slide after this? This is the last slide.
No, that's it. It's just a reminder that if you would like to find these links later and you've closed this chat, you can always find these in Neurostars as well. So you've got, if you go to either the interactive students or the observer students category, then there's a daily student reflection link and information. And so you can always find this link there. But please don't fill it out until you've gone through the whole day, because then it's kind of like, what's the point? Thanks, guys.
Great. And so here we are also joined by Gunnar Blom, who on Slack is called The Viking and has been doing all kinds of things for Neomatch Academy. Gunnar, why don't you briefly introduce yourself?
Thank you, Conrad. So as you know, I'm at Queen's University, and I'm generally interested in sensory motor control kind of questions. Anything sort of from decision-making, working memory, to planning and actual control of movements of pretty much anywhere in the body, mostly eyes and arms though. So I don't want to say much more about me, because you can look me up anytime. I brought my Viking hairstyle just to prove that I'm actually sort of Viking instead of the hat. But if you want me to wear a hat, I can also wear a hat.
I think there will be a majority opinion that wants a Viking hat. I've got to admit that.
Yeah, I don't have a Viking hat here. Sorry, Vikings actually it's a myth that Vikings wore
Coordinated.
It's actually wrong. Vikings do not wear the horns hats. It's out of the movies. It's not real. They did not wear hats.
But you could wear a hat, in which case Vikings would wear hats.
I could wear a hat. This is my Canadian outdoors hat. I can wear that. But I think it's much better without.
Okay, great. So why don't we jump right back into the question? So the first question is a question by Virginia Lee, who asks, why do we use entropy to compare models? Why choose Shannon entropy? Could anyone explain information theory a bit? Do any of you want to take it? Should I take it?
I just want to say briefly, I won't actually answer the question. I just want to say briefly that you will learn about information theory in week 2. So I think it's a little too early to really go into the depth of that. But maybe Conrad can say a quick word about why we use it for comparing models. Yeah,
so there's multiple levels for this question, and I'm not 100% sure which one is meant. So the first one is we use for tutorial 2. We use this to compare, say, exponential versus like just a single peak versus double peak and things like that. Why do we do that? We do that because the way we formalize the normative model has the structure that we say there is a constraint, maybe the number of spikes is fixed. And given that constraint, a neuron wants to transmit as much information as possible. No, and so if this is the idea, then we need an operational definition of information. Now, there are alternative measures of information on top of Shannon information, but Shannon information is the kind of information where we say, how much information can we get through a channel where we have a sender and we have a receiver? That kind of maps on how we might think about the brain. Like where you can say, I'm a neuron, I transmit something. There's something that I know that other neurons need to know. And therefore, I kind of need to get the information through the channel. And the channel capacity is limited because, well, every spike costs a certain amount of energy. In fact, there's like beautiful work where they try and count that, where they're like, okay, if I have a spike, what happens to the neuron? Well, I need to take the membrane potential, which normally sits at -70, and I need to kind of charge it all the way up to the top of the spike and put it back down, which means that I need a certain amount of current in and a certain amount of current out, which means that I need a certain amount of sodium and a certain amount of potassium in the opposite direction, which means that I need to have a certain number of ATP molecules, and therefore it's not good if I spike too often. And it's like a beautiful field that does those calculations. So if we start from there, you could say we can normatively justify our constraint, where we say like using more spikes means we need to like take spikes out somewhere else. And then we can also normatively make the point for some measure of information being optimized. Now, why exactly do we use Shannon? Well, that's a little involved, and I don't think we should talk about it under one. But that's like roughly the answer to this question. But thank you, Virginia. Let's talk about the second question. This is a question by Jack Dolgen, and I should apologize to all you guys. We are from so many different cultures that I will mess up the pronunciation of every single name here. And what can I do? Like you feel free to like totally mangle my name. So here's the question. I guess one of, maybe the assumption of the Y model is that evolution has sort of fine-tuned our biology behavior to maximize results. Is it fair to assume that's always true? That there even is a Y explanation in all cases, even if we haven't discovered what it is yet? That sounds like a great question, maybe for Kate, or like who's the right person to answer that?
I can kick that off. I think that the first statement that the assumption of the Y model is that there's sort of a force, evolution, sort of behavior over the course of a lifespan that has pushed the system to solve a problem in a particular way. I don't, and I'd be interested to hear what the rest of the panel has to say about the second question, because my intuition would be no. And I think that the reason why is that we're not going around the world solving all possible problems all the time. So it could be that we've figured out a way to solve a problem, but because of other constraints that we have, we haven't necessarily, there isn't necessarily pressure to solve that particular problem in an optimal way. And so one way that I think about normative models is that, okay, we're working on understanding this particular phenomena or this particular behavior. If I take into account the inputs to the system and what the goal is, can I write down and all of the constraints, can I write down how I should solve that problem? And that sort of gives you a starting point to compare behavior to. And if humans behave, and you want to design sort of, I personally love models that inspire experiments. And at the end of these models, it's really nice to have a set of sort of cranks that you can push back and forth and see what the pattern of behavior is of the model, and then compare that to a pattern of behavior in human subjects, or any sort of subjects when you're talking about behavioral experiments. And so I think that the answer to the second question is no. That's the short answer, and the long answer I kind of just gave you. So thoughts on the second question? Yeah,
I just want to give an example of a non-optimally evolved system, which is essentially our eyes. the retina is sort of inside out in a very strange way. The photoreceptors are hidden behind a whole bunch of neurons, and the light gets filtered essentially before it hits those, which is really not optimal in terms of vision. Like the other way around would be much better. We would have much better night vision, for example. And so this seems to be, and so I don't know what the answer exactly is here, but I think a lot of people think about it in the sense that at some point evolution took a turn and got stuck with that particular solution, and there was no way to reverse it. And that's why it is the way it is. So the answer is often no. And maybe the one of the goals of developing these Y models is to figure out in which cases we're not obeying a certain optimality criterion, and then we can try to ask why.
That's actually one of my favorite ways to use Y models, is to say, oh, well, here's the normative thing. Here's like what the mathematically perfect system would do. But here's actually a better description that fits our behavior or our system. Mm-hmm. Like, why is that the case? Why is this weird, like kludged together, like half solution actually the way that we're doing it? And so you can actually ask and answer really like cool questions about the problem that the system is actually solving, instead of like what we think the mathematically optimal thing that it should be solving would be. So it's kind of like breaking the normative models and seeing if you can break them in the same way. I like that.
Yeah, let me just try and produce some clarity there. So basically, do you believe that evolution makes something optimal? Never. How would that be possible? No, like basically, evolution makes things better, but like there's typically very wide minima where like there's like lots of solutions that are like pretty good. No, like human vision is like actually pretty good outside of the blind spot, maybe, and the blind spot's pretty small. Like so basically, there's no way that we should expect it to be optimal. But there's something that is beautiful about these models, which is that we can meaningfully think about it. You know, like we can, if people just say research about like people walking, like we can kind of speculate, well, if you walk, you shouldn't waste your energy. You also shouldn't break your bones. And these like simple why insights actually reveal a lot of complexity that we can actually understand meaningfully. So it's not optimal, but like keep in mind that our like how models also no model describes all the variants, and it shouldn't. And like in particular for normative models for say evolutionary new behaviors, like it shouldn't be optimal.
There was a great question last night in the Asia Q&A that was kind of about that, which is like, how do you know if your model is right? And the answer is like, usually it's not. Usually it is wrong, but if it's wrong in an interesting way, then you can still learn something.
I think that all models are wrong.
Yeah,
it's just
so we went into the
viewers.
We went into the classic answer to that, but I think that it follows on this very nicely, right? That if you discover how your model is wrong, even if it's your normative model that's wrong, then that's also really interesting.
So the model's wrong, like people always say, yeah, all models are wrong, but some are useful, which is sort of like, sure. The reason why models are wrong is because models by definition are an abstraction of reality. And as soon as you abstract, you remove, right? You remove things that you're not interested in. You remove things that you cannot describe. You remove things that you don't even know about. And as such, they're modeled to a certain degree of approximation of the reality, but they're never the reality. Otherwise, it would be called reality and not a model. So they're always wrong.
Yeah, and there's a corollary that comes from that, which is because our models are wrong, proving a model wrong isn't actually so interesting. Like there is this big excitement about falsification in science. And in physics, that has been tremendous. But in physics, the space of possible models is small. They're like all like very short equations. If we're outside of that space, it's much more pragmatic. Like the space of models that we deal with in psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, it's a very big space. And therefore, like if we're willing to acknowledge that all our models are wrong, then if I say, well, it could be model A or model B, then disproving A doesn't in any meaningful way make B very likely. And you find this logical mistake all over the neuroscience literature.
Including in my own work.
I've been there done that. I didn't get a T-shirt for it. But I did just order my organizer's T-shirt for the Neuromatch Academy because someone drew a really
There are
gorgeous.
organizers T-shirts.
It says it won't be much work on the back. I really want one too, that we can get them in the NeuroStars thread, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Someone in your stars is sharing that for the organizers. So
Perfect.
in any case, hopefully next time I lecture, I get to, I do a Q&A, I get to show off my new T-shirt. But so let me read the next question. So this is a question by Liu Shuzi. And the question is, this is a question from my pod about the material today. We learned in tutorial 1 that the interspike interval distribution is roughly exponential. Since the exponential distribution is the PDF of time between consecutive Poisson events, does this imply that the spiking of the neuron at hand, not presynaptic ones, is generated by a Poisson process? No. Okay, let me first answer the first one. Now, it's right that if we have a Poisson process, then because it has this randomness and everything is independent, technically it would be a Bernoulli process, no, where you could say, basically in each very short time interval, I have a certain probability of spiking and a certain probability of not spiking. But there's the reverse hold, that if I have an exponential distribution of interspike intervals, then things would be Poisson. And here's the counterexample. I take all the interspike intervals, and then I order them. So what happens is that the neuron goes like click, 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 very fast, and then click, click, and it gets slower and slower, slower and slower over time. In that case, it has exactly the same interspike interval distribution. It just has the fast ones early and the slow ones late, and that's not a Poisson distribution in that sense. And so that's that. Yeah, and it's important to realize that just because if it's a Bernoulli process, it produces an exponential interspike interval. The reverse isn't true. The inverted one is true. No, if it is not an exponential distribution, it cannot be produced by that process. But it doesn't go the other direction.
Sort of like a correlation versus causation question almost here.
Oh yeah, and we have week 3, day 3 to the whole causation component. So hold on, there is another question here. If so, in tutorial 2 for the model where only excitatory input, Poisson of lambda is inputted, why isn't the spike of the neuron from a Poisson process anymore? Well, yeah, I don't know. In this case, we have a process, Poisson, that's integrated over time. And the process of integration makes it be very non-Poisson. I'm not sure if I'm good at explaining it.
Yeah, this is a hard one to explain intuitively without actually walking through the simulation. But the idea is that as soon as you start integrating, you're essentially transforming the sort of these random events into a random walk. And that random walk essentially has a certain statistic that is potentially very different from the process that generates or controls the random walk. And that is why you don't get necessarily a Poisson, or typically you don't get a Poisson process out unless you have perfect leakage.
Great. So why don't we go to the next question? The next question is anonymous, and it's a philosophical question. So in Y models, we start out taking for granted the optimization in general and the entropy in the specific example. But why is optimization used to answer the Y question? What is the philosophy and bigger idea behind the Y model? Who wants to take it?
I have to process this for a little second here.
Yeah, I'm actually not quite sure what the question really is. I mean, when you ask the why question, you typically want to understand the underlying principles. And of course, when you talk principles, it's sort of like, what do you understand by principles? And what does even understanding mean in a certain way, right? So to all of us, understanding means something different because we can understand at different levels, for example. Depending on our interests, we might be satisfied with an understanding of behavior or not. We might say like, no, understanding to me means how the synapses that feed the neurons, etc., actually generate that behavior, right? And so I feel like here it's a little bit going in the same direction where when you ask why, you might have an interest at different levels here. But ultimately, you want to know sort of like, what is the underlying fundamental reason that something happens?
Yeah, so the Y models usually have the following logic, where you say there exists a problem, and we believe that that evolution should have found the best solution to this problem, under with constraints and so forth, and of course not the optimal, but a good solution to that. Okay, but finding a good solution means that we take the thing that the definition of goodness, the so-called cost function or objective function or utility function, that we take that definition of goodness and find a model that makes this be at a high value, like that finds the good solution to us. If we talk about walking, we need a process that says, of all the ways that I could walk, this is the one that say maybe minimizes energy or something like that. And this is where optimization comes in. Like optimization comes in because the problem's definition is usually in terms of a scale. Now, if we'd be in a binary world where it's like either you achieve it or not, then optimization arguably goes away. I just try a few things until I achieve it. But that's usually not the flavor that these problems have in behavior. Cool, but I think it's a very interesting philosophical question here. Good. So here we have a question of Igor Zverev. 280th neuron is just the best. There are a lot of neurons with roughly uniform distribution, for example, 160 and many more. Why? We figured out it is not optimal. Is that okay for us to make a model with exponential distribution? Also, the 280th neuron seems to be so perfect, and there's a huge number of neurons which are significantly different. Is it okay to judge by the 280th neuron? We assume that nature is optimal, but what if that is not entirely true? This is a great question. Who wants to take the question of basically, like we selected a neuron. Why did we select that neuron?
You're at the tutorial.
I can give
I have an answer to this, right? But I think you wrote the tutorial. This is written about the 283rd neuron, Conrad.
Okay.
Why not?
So let me tell all of you a dirty secret. You will find across neuroscience lots of models. These models never do perfectly if you look at the diversity of neurons that really exist.
Wait,
almost never.
What? Really? Really?
No, but the level of that, for people that are new to neuroscience, they are not aware of the degree to which that is. Now, if we say neurons are exponential, yes, if we average all of them, it kind of looks pretty exponential. In the typical neuroscience paper, you have in figure 1 or 2, you have something like typical neuron is what it says. If you do a reanalysis, which is progressively possible because people share their data, the typical neuron is never typical. It's the neuron that is closest to the theory that people are writing about. So basically, these outliers are always there. The typical neurons that like perfectly fit the model, like oftentimes don't exist. And the model like just describes behavior in broad strokes. And that's Gunnar talked about it earlier. And like we have these we have these models that are kind of approximations. They're untrue, but they kind of capture like something that is common. Gunnar.
Yeah, so you can even say like when you played with the EI balance, right? The EI balance is sort of like on average true in the brain. But if you look at the papers that actually look at the EI balance, like the average is pretty much 1-to-1, but then the standard deviation is like huge. Like each individual neuron is like they're all over the place. And like as a population, it's fairly balanced, but for an individual neuron, definitely not. And so you can, if you play around with the model you built today, and you change the EI balance essentially, you will see that you get all of a sudden different statistics out of it, and that's sort of like part of it. But there's other factors, of course.
Kate, you will also.
Go.
Hey, Kate, why don't you go next?
I wanted to know. I sort of feel that the field is making a transition right now to trying to consider populations of neurons instead of individual neurons in this regard. I think we spent several decades looking, and because of limitations of how we were recording and what we were trying to learn at the time, that we were recording individual neurons or small groups of neurons at a time, and then trying to characterize basically sort of what individual neurons do. And now there are more groups talking more about like what do big groups of neurons do together, which is really these are questions I think I'm more interested in, which is like how does the brain support our behavior in our everyday lives, both sort of visual processing and also like our cognitive behavior. And these are all super interesting questions and are probably why a lot of us ended up here, both the four of us here and then all of you out there asking questions. And so I'm going to bring this back around. So what I would say specifically about this question is that there are a lot of people now that are starting to think more carefully about ways of characterizing neurons that captures the diversity of responses in a population in a particular area. It's no longer sufficient to just say, oh, this is middle temporal area. Sorry, this is area MT. In the brain, it does motion. Right, because these 45 neurons are well tuned to motion in a particular direction. It turns out MT is pretty responsive to motion, but it's not like every cell that you hit in MT is going to do that all the time. So, and I think it's too, and this is related to some things we've already been talking about, we don't always, we stick our recording devices into brains, onto brains, and we set up these paradigms to ask questions about what particular brain areas do, but we're kind of, in many ways, shooting in the dark, right? We don't, like, I work a lot on representations, and when you're looking for a representation, you're assuming that the set of features that you've started with are the right set of features. And so, you know, those neurons that aren't firing very much or don't have the classic presentation, you can't say they're doing nothing. You haven't, like, we don't know what the population is doing. You also don't know, even from the perspective of looking at the responses of individual neurons, what if you showed a different stimulus? Like, what would happen then? But narrowing that down is really difficult, which is why, which is another reason why I think we're moving to these, thinking about bigger populations and describing sort of a macro, higher level processing.
Yeah. Can I follow? Yeah. I think that's it. I totally agree that like this is where the field is going. And it's also because we kind of initially in our early electrophysiological recordings, like in CAT V1, it was like, oh, look, this neuron spikes to vertical stuff. And it really likes vertical stuff. And that was like really easy to understand because us with our like, you know, relatively puny capacity for understanding, we were like, great. That is the feature that this thing likes. And the other ones are just noise. The ones that like don't do something that we understand, that's just like our recording system messed up, or I don't understand, and I'm going to bury that in supplemental, and I'm going to just show the pretty neuron that likes the vertical stuff. But I totally agree that now we're going towards the not just the population level, but also that like the heterogeneity is not just noise, it's meaningful. And that by studying which neurons do what, we actually might learn something really interesting about why the brain is organized that way. And also, this always assumes that our spike sorting was right. So that's a whole other level, right? So, like, we assume that like this spike rate is actually the true spike rate, but like all we have is this crummy electrode that we stick in this particular spot in the brain, and maybe like the signal is not perfect.
And so just to tag onto that one more time, I think in remarking on the sort of early visual neuroscience and early physiology, we got incredibly lucky that the early visual cortex was so accessible in so many mammals, and that it was so systematic, because we learned so much. And that sort of prepared us to embark on these bigger problems now.
But it's also limiting how we're thinking now.
Yes.
Because now we go and we stick a Utah array in like prefrontal cortex, where we have this mixed selectivity, and we have these population codes, and we have all this like complex high dimensionality of representations.
And we tried tuning curves.
We have no idea what we're looking at. Yeah. So it's kind of, we got in this paradigm where we went looking for neurons that like one thing, and they have these really beautiful tuning curves to the one feature or the one set of features that they really like. And it's hard to get out of that, because it's so seductively attractive to be like, I get it. I understand what this neuron is doing.
But I just want to point out a mistake of that literature from my perspective, which is, it's right. What they do is they take a stimulus, maybe they take a bar and they rotate the bar, and they go like, firing rate goes up and it goes down, and it's super reliable across lots of neurons. But that experiment does not establish that the neuron doesn't care about other things. For all that we know, if we change the color, the context, or all kinds of things, or the fact if the animal is walking or not, everything is going to be very different. And I think in that sense that the field has systematically misinterpreted the findings. So the neuroscience, systems neuroscience, looks back on a history of, you change one dimension, you find that it affects the firing rate a lot, and then you assume that all the rest doesn't. It doesn't matter. And like, I think that logic is just not justified.
Can I throw another wrench into this? Sorry.
We like wrenches. Go ahead.
So when people look for representations, it very often is sort of like an end goal, because the neuron cares about something, right? And that is just a fundamental mistake, in my opinion. Neurons don't care about the outside world. Neurons don't see the outside world. Neurons have no consciousness about the outside world. Neurons are devices that compute. Sorry, Megan.
I agree with you.
but neurons are devices that compute, right? So Conrad wrote an excellent paper on the microprocessor that is very much like thought-provoking in with that respect, which is essentially asking, if you're randomly tapping into a microprocessor, can you understand it? And the answer is like it's very, very hard, at least, and the brain is 1,000 times more or more complicated than that. And so what we're doing with receptive field mapping is essentially something like sticking an electrode into a microprocessor and asking, well, now I'm going to look at the gates or the gate times and try to understand how the brain works. But it doesn't tell you anything about a computation, about a transformation of information that somehow takes sensory information and does the one thing that the brain is supposed to do: generate behavior.
Great, cool. We have a lot more questions to go to. So here we have a question by Yao Yao. The Rising and Song Kai Wu says they wanted to ask a very similar question. So the rising part of the ISI histogram was not modeled. Definitely isn't modeled by the exponential function in the tutorial. Is that part interesting? What do you guys think?
I can answer that if you want. So yes, that's correct. We did not model that. And yes, it is interesting. And the first thing is that you can ask, well, why is the ISI histogram not actually following the exponential function? What's happening there, right? So you can ask all kinds of questions about this. And the quick answer, and I think I said that very briefly in one of my intro slides, is that neurons have a refractory period. And if you take a refractory period into account, then you can actually also describe the rising part of the ISI histogram. But that's only one possibility. There might be other ones.
Yeah, that's a good number. And yes, this is, I mean, like, I need you to understand that here on day one, we don't do all the things that are interesting about spike trains. That would be bad for my career if there was all the things that were interesting about it. Spikes have so many aspects that literally 1,000 professors are spending their entire lifetime trying to understand them. And that means, yes, the rising flank is just as interesting as the falling flank. It's just that the models are maybe not quite as simple for that. So here, what else do we have? We have answered this question. So here is a question by Michael Cohen. What is the origin of this what, how, why distinction in computational modeling? I think it's a cool way to break down models, so I may want to cite this in the future. Who wants to talk about the history of this?
Well, it was first introduced by Peter Dayan and Larry Abbott, I believe, in their 2001 textbook. So that's sort of like the standard textbook, I guess, in computational neuroscience. It's only one way to really classify models. Only one way to think about, what type of model is a particular model, what type of approach am I currently using. There's many different ways you can use. You can use scale, for example, right? So what's the size of the system that a model describes? Some of you might have heard of David Marr's classification scheme of computational, algorithmic, and physical or implementational, which has sort of parallels with the Dayan and Abbott classification scheme, but has subtleties that are different. And you can imagine other ones that sort of like go in orthogonal directions. The important part here really is not so much to think about, and of course there's models that span different, like this model can be how and what, or why and how, and typically the what is always included once you get like to the higher levels. But the idea is that it's not important necessarily to come up with the perfect classification system. Actually, that doesn't make sense at all. But the importance is that to realize that the different types of models have sort of their individual different superpowers. And knowing those superpowers and the limitations of these kinds of models is very important when you try to understand what they can provide to you, and when you try to achieve a particular goal, to answer a particular question. So this is essentially what tomorrow will be all about, is to define those questions correctly, to find the goals, and then as a function of that, actually choose the right type of modeling that actually answers that. So, and to do that, you have to, of course, understand what different kinds of models can buy you, and that's what today was about. And hopefully, you get some insight about this.
And I think tomorrow also there'll be like this introduction of this iterative process, right? Where you don't just do a how model and then like call it a day. Like that's not usually the way that this works. And so if you want to really dig into a phenomenon, you usually end up with the what and the how, and also like multiple scales maybe, or like something else. And so each piece of the model can answer different types of questions and achieve the different goals. So that's something that we'll talk about tomorrow.
Great. So I want to say the hour is over. So anyone who has like a meeting somewhere, don't feel bad about leaving us. Like, as opposed to like an offline conference, this is like not awkward at all to just close the call. I am positive no one will look funny at you. You will not block the view to the stage for anyone, so you can just we will go like a couple minutes extra because that's like the modal distribution. We will go like maybe 5-10 minutes extra, I think. But definitely don't feel bad about like just abandoning us here.
We got an extra person in response to that. They're all still here, and now there's an extra person too.
Great, yeah. Great. So here we have a question by Linqi Sang. Typical models of neural coding assume a rate code, and if I understand things correctly, features such as interspike intervals are usually ignored. How does the analysis we did today reconcile with rate codes? Are there interesting examples of neural coding using spike timing? So who wants to take Linqi's question?
I can take it if you want. So So first of all, the what and how that does not ask at all about information transmission, right? So when we talk about the precise spike timing, we're typically interested in or the spike rate per se. We're asking essentially, how does the neuron transmit information? Is it just by some average firing level, or is it by the exact times, right? You can imagine that if the time is 1 millisecond, that codes for, I want to eat chocolate now, and if the time is 10 milliseconds, I need coffee now, and then if it's 100 milliseconds, then I don't know, maybe I'm tired now, something like that, or I need beer. So that's essentially sort of the difference between the rate and the time codes, and we haven't asked that question really. The only time we have asked that question is in the Y model, but we have sort of like not given you a choice. We have just assumed that time coding exists, that the temporal code exists. And then we have essentially asked, okay, if it exists, then what's the best way to code the information with a given number of spikes so that we can transmit a maximum amount of information with those limited spikes that we have available. So that is sort of what I would say as an answer to this. So we haven't ignored, or we haven't really addressed actually the fact of whether one or the other is used, or how that is, or whether it's a mixture or anything like that. We have totally kept that open. We have just made some assumptions, and then we have run with that.
Right. So it's the opposite of a rate code. Now, like just to be clear, the question that our specific Y model does is, if I view every interspike interval kind of like as a code word, what kind of a model gets most information through it? Let's take maybe 2 more questions.